A detailed summary and reflection on the Sabha Parva, the second book of the Mahabharata. The magnificent hall built by a demon architect, the great imperial sacrifice, the killing of Jarasandha, the first honor given to Krishna, the beheading of Shishupala, Duryodhana's burning jealousy, the fraudulent dice game. The Sabha Parva, or the Book of the Assembly Hall, consists of 78 sections and 2507 shlokas. It opens with the demon architect Maya, spared from the Khandava fire by Arjuna, fulfilling his debt by building a celestial assembly hall for Yudhishthira at Indraprastha. The hall is unlike anything in the world of men, floors that look like water, water that looks like solid ground, walls set with jewels, and a beauty that makes every visiting king feel small. The sage Narada arrives and describes the assembly halls of the gods, those belonging to Indra, Yama, Varuna, Kubera, and Brahma, which inspires Yudhishthira to think about performing the Rajasuya sacrifice to claim sovereignty over all the kings of the earth. Before the sacrifice can happen, the powerful king Jarasandha of Magadha must be dealt with, since he has captured and imprisoned 86 kings and plans to sacrifice them to Shiva when he has 100. Krishna, Bhima, and Arjuna travel to Magadha in disguise, and Bhima kills Jarasandha in a bare-handed wrestling duel that lasts 14 days. The freed kings support Yudhishthira's claim to imperial power. The four brothers then undertake the Digvijaya, the conquest of the four directions, each subjugating the kingdoms of his quarter. The Rajasuya sacrifice is performed with enormous grandeur. At the ceremony, the first worship, called Arghya, is offered to Krishna, which enrages Shishupala, the king of Chedi, who launches a furious verbal attack on Bhishma and Krishna. When Shishupala's insults cross 100, Krishna beheads him with the Sudarshana discus. Duryodhana visits Indraprastha after the sacrifice and is overwhelmed by the palace's wealth and beauty. He is humiliated when he mistakes a crystal floor for water and falls. Draupadi laughs. That laughter never leaves him. Back in Hastinapura, Duryodhana and Shakuni conspire to invite Yudhishthira to a game of dice. Yudhishthira cannot refuse the invitation without violating the code of a warrior. In the gambling match that follows, Shakuni plays on Yudhishthira's behalf and through deceit wins everything: Yudhishthira's wealth, his kingdom, his brothers, himself, and finally Draupadi. Draupadi is dragged into the open assembly by her hair. She asks a question that no one in the hall can answer. Was Yudhishthira already a slave when he staked her, and if so, did he have the right to stake anyone at all? The question hangs in the air while Bhishma, Drona, Vidura, and Dhritarashtra all stay silent. Eventually Dhritarashtra intervenes and grants Draupadi 3 boons, restoring the Pandavas. But Duryodhana demands a second game. The Pandavas lose again. The penalty is 12 years of forest exile followed by 1 year of life in complete disguise. If they are recognized during the 13th year, the exile begins again from the start. By the time the Sabha Parva opens, the Pandavas have survived everything that was thrown at them. They escaped the burning house of lac. They wandered the forests disguised as Brahmins. They won Draupadi at her Swayamvara. They revealed themselves, returned to Hastinapura, and received their half of the kingdom. The land they were given was difficult, a dry and forested place called Khandava, but they did not complain. They built a city there instead. They called it Indraprastha, and it was extraordinary. Maya, the demon architect who had been spared from the Khandava fire as Arjuna's favor, built them a palace and an assembly hall that had no equal in the world of men. For a while things were good. The Pandavas ruled wisely. People came to Indraprastha from many kingdoms to live and to serve. The 5 brothers were united, their city was thriving, and their queen Draupadi ran the household with a firm and graceful hand. Anyone watching from the outside might have thought the Pandavas had finally found their peace. But the Sabha Parva is not about peace. It is about what happens when success is visible to people who cannot bear to see it. Everything that goes well for the Pandavas in this book is seen by Duryodhana. Everything that Duryodhana sees, he wants destroyed. The Sabha Parva is the story of how a magnificent hall becomes the site of the greatest betrayal in the Mahabharata. It is the story of how a game of dice can take a kingdom, 5 free men, and 1 queen and reduce them to nothing in a single afternoon. Maya owed Arjuna his life. When the Khandava forest burned, Arjuna had protected him from the fire at Krishna's request. Maya was an asura, a demon, but he was also the greatest architect in any of the 3 worlds. He wanted to repay his debt properly. He asked Arjuna what he could build for him. Arjuna told him to ask Yudhishthira instead. Yudhishthira asked for an assembly hall worthy of the Pandavas. Maya worked for 14 months. What he built was not simply a building. It was a space that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The floors in certain sections were made of crystal so clear that they looked like open water. A visiting king who was used to walking on dry ground would stop at the edge of one of these floors, certain he was about to step into a pool. The pools of actual water in other parts of the hall were covered with petals so thick that they looked like solid ground. Lotus flowers floated at the surface. Fish swam below. The walls were set with precious stones. The pillars caught the light and scattered it in every direction. The hall had doors of pure gold, inner courts, treasure rooms, and spaces for assembly, all arranged so that every part felt both grand and welcoming. One particular detail becomes important later: the different sections of the floor. What looked like water was dry. What looked like dry ground was water. It was all illusion, all beauty, all designed to dazzle. Maya had built the hall with the same logic a jeweler uses. Every surface should make the viewer feel they have never seen anything so fine. When Yudhishthira held court in this hall, every king who came to him came away feeling they had visited something beyond ordinary human achievement. Narada came too. And it was Narada's visit that started everything that followed. Narada was a sage who moved between all the worlds, the world of men, the world of the gods, the world below, as easily as a person moves between rooms in a house. He was never still. He always carried news, observations, and questions that made the people he visited think hard about their own lives. He arrived at Indraprastha and looked around the new hall with an appreciative eye. Yudhishthira welcomed him warmly and offered him the best seat in the assembly. They talked for a long time. Narada was full of wisdom and strange information. He told Yudhishthira about the assembly halls of the gods. He described Indra's hall, which was built of light and could not be approached by ordinary humans. He described Yama's hall, where the dead came to receive their judgments. He described Varuna's hall, deep in the waters of the cosmic ocean. He described Kubera's hall, filled with the wealth of the universe. He described Brahma's hall, where time moved differently and silence had its own kind of weight. He told Yudhishthira that the great kings of the past, those who had performed the highest sacrifices and earned the highest merit, sat in these divine halls even now. Then he mentioned something that struck Yudhishthira like a well-aimed arrow. He mentioned the Rajasuya sacrifice. He said that a king who successfully performed the Rajasuya became a sovereign above all other kings, a samrat, an emperor. He said the ancient king Harishchandra had performed it and had sat among the gods afterward, respected by every being in every world. He looked at Yudhishthira for a moment and said nothing more. He did not need to. Yudhishthira heard the unspoken suggestion clearly. He started thinking about it that very evening. He summoned Krishna to discuss it. Krishna listened, thought carefully, and told Yudhishthira exactly what stood in the way. Krishna explained that the Rajasuya was not simply a matter of performing rituals and inviting guests. for it to be valid, all the kings of the earth had to either accept Yudhishthira's sovereignty or be defeated by him. Most kings would accept. But one king would not. That king was Jarasandha of Magadha, and he was a problem unlike any other. Jarasandha had been born in two halves and joined together by a demoness named Zra, whose name he carried. He was almost impossibly strong. He had already defeated most of the kings of the earth in battle. But his ambition had taken a particular and disturbing shape. He was collecting living kings. He had captured 86 of them and was keeping them imprisoned in a mountain fortress. He intended to capture 100 kings in total and then sacrifice them all to Shiva in one great ritual. The 86 already imprisoned were still alive, waiting in their cages, counting the days. Krishna said Jarasandha could not be defeated in open battle. An army would not work. But there was a chance in a wrestling duel. Jarasandha had never refused a challenge to single combat because he considered himself the greatest wrestler alive. If someone challenged him and beat him, the threat would end, the imprisoned kings would be freed, and they would all feel grateful to Yudhishthira. There was a second problem too. Jarasandha hated Krishna because Krishna had once been driven out of his original city Mathura by Jarasandha's repeated attacks. Krishna had eventually abandoned Mathura and moved his people to Dwarka by the sea, and he had never forgotten that humiliation. He was not neutral on the subject of Jarasandha. He wanted him dead. But he also knew that only Bhima had any real chance in a wrestling match with him. Bhima was the strongest man alive. Even then it would not be easy. Krishna proposed that he and Bhima and Arjuna travel to Magadha in disguise and challenge Jarasandha directly. Yudhishthira heard this and his face went pale. He did not want to send his most beloved brother and his dearest friend into danger on a mission that might fail. But he also understood that the Rajasuya could not happen as long as Jarasandha was alive and collecting kings. He agreed. Krishna, Bhima, and Arjuna arrived at Magadha dressed as Brahmins. This was unusual enough to attract notice, since Brahmins did not usually walk with the bearing of warriors or carry themselves with such obvious physical power. Jarasandha received them and offered hospitality as custom required. Then he looked at them again and something told him these were not ordinary men of learning. He asked them who they really were. Krishna told him the truth. He introduced himself, Bhima, and Arjuna by name. He explained why they had come. He told Jarasandha about the imprisoned kings and said that keeping free men in cages was not the act of a righteous king. He offered Jarasandha a choice, release the kings or fight. Jarasandha did not flinch. He was a proud man and he was genuinely fearless. He chose to fight. He chose Bhima as his opponent. They began to wrestle in an open courtyard. They were evenly matched in a way that made watching them difficult, like watching two mountains push against each other. They wrestled through one day and then another. The duel went on for 14 days. Jarasandha was experienced and clever. Bhima was enormous and relentless. Each time one of them seemed to have an advantage, it slipped away. The two men breathed in heavy gasps and kept going. Jarasandha had a weakness that only Krishna knew. Because he had been born in two halves, he could only be killed by being torn apart. Simply beating him was not enough. He would recover from ordinary injury. Krishna gave Bhima a sign by tearing a twig down the middle and throwing it away in opposite directions. Bhima understood. He grabbed Jarasandha, lifted him overhead, and tore him into along the line where his body had been joined at birth. He threw the pieces in opposite directions so they could not rejoin. Jarasandha fell and did not rise. The imprisoned kings were freed from the mountain fortress. They came out blinking and unsteady, grateful beyond expression. Each of them swore loyalty to Yudhishthira. Jarasandha's own son Sahadev was made king of Magadha in his father's place, and he too accepted Yudhishthira's sovereignty. The largest obstacle to the Rajasuya had been removed. The three companions returned to Indraprastha with good news and with the freed kings walking behind them like proof of what had been done. The next step was the Digvijaya, the conquest of the four directions. Every king in every corner of the known world had to acknowledge Yudhishthira's supremacy before the Rajasuya could begin. The four younger brothers divided the task between them. Each took an army and went in a different direction. Arjuna went north. Bhima went east. Sahadev went south. Nakula went west. Each journey was long and the battles were real. Many kings submitted without a fight when they heard who was coming. The name of Arjuna alone made many rulers think twice before refusing. Others fought and were defeated. Some were defeated and then treated so generously that they became loyal friends rather than resentful subjects. The brothers fought, negotiated, received tribute, and moved on through weeks and months of travel. Arjuna's northern campaign took him through the Himalayan kingdoms and into regions where the weather itself was an enemy. He fought the Gandharvas, made alliances with mountain kings, and pushed north until he reached the very edge of the known world. Bhima's eastern campaign covered the kingdoms along the great rivers and brought in tribes and rulers who had never before acknowledged a Kuru king. Sahadev went south through the Deccan, past kingdoms rich in gold and timber, down to the southern sea. Nakula swept through the western kingdoms, through the deserts and the coastal cities, and returned with tributes from kings who had never heard of Indraprastha before his army appeared at their gates. By the time all four returned to Indraprastha, the list of kings who had agreed to come to the Rajasuya was enormous. The wealth that arrived in tribute filled storehouses that had to be expanded to hold it. Gold and silver, elephants and horses, silks and spices, everything that kingdoms produced came flowing toward Indraprastha as a sign of acknowledgement. Yudhishthira looked at it all and felt the weight of what he was being asked to be. He was no longer just the eldest Pandav. He was about to become the emperor of the world. The Rajasuya sacrifice was performed on a scale that had not been seen in living memory. Every great king came. Bhishma came from Hastinapura. Drona came. Karna came, though he was already beginning to feel the edge of rivalry with the Pandavas. Duryodhana came with his brothers, outwardly there to pay respects, inwardly watching everything with an expression that could not quite decide between admiration and hatred. Dhritarashtra came. Sages and priests came from every direction. The rituals were complex and long and required enormous precision. The Brahmins who conducted them were the best in the land. The various tasks of the sacrifice were distributed among the great men present. Bhishma and Drona oversaw the arrangements. Duryodhana managed the treasury and accounts. Ashwatthama watched over the food. Sanjay greeted and welcomed the arriving kings. Vidura distributed gifts. Krishna, who said he was simply a devotee of Yudhishthira, took on the humble task of washing the feet of the arriving guests. He did it without complaint or pride, and everyone noticed. It said something about him that no speech could have expressed better. The sacrifice proceeded through its many stages. The air was thick with the smoke of the sacred fire. The sound of Vedic chanting filled the space from morning to night. Yudhishthira sat at the center of it all, accepting the role of Samrat, the supreme ruler, while trying to remain the same quiet, careful man he had always been. He did not enjoy the power. He accepted it as a duty. That was the difference between him and the man who was watching him from the other side of the assembly hall. When the main rituals were complete, the time came to offer the first worship, the Arghya, to the most honored guest in the assembly. In a gathering of this size, with kings and sages and warriors from across the world, choosing who received the first honor was a significant decision. It would be a statement about whom the Pandavas considered the greatest among them all. Bhishma stood and made the recommendation. He said the Arghya should be offered to Krishna. He gave his reasons clearly and at length. Krishna was not simply a king, he was the soul of the universe in human form, and no matter who else was present, no honor could surpass what was owed to him. The Pandavas agreed immediately. The Arghya was offered to Krishna. Shishupala, the king of Chedi, rose from his seat. He was furious. He was also carrying a long-standing personal grievance against Krishna that went back many years, since Krishna had once carried away a woman Shishupala had intended to marry. His anger had been building for a long time, and the Arghya to Krishna was all it needed to spill over. He began to shout. He said Bhishma was old and had lost his judgment. He said there were kings in that assembly who were greater, more powerful, more righteous than Krishna. He listed them. He said giving the first honor to Krishna was an insult to every king who had come. He called Krishna a cowherd, a man of low birth, unworthy of sitting in a royal assembly let alone receiving its first honor. The assembly went quiet in the way a room goes quiet when something is said that cannot be unsaid. Bhishma answered Shishupala calmly but with the unmistakable firmness of a man who has made up his mind. He said Shishupala could leave if he wished, but the Arghya would remain with Krishna. Other kings began to take sides. Some agreed with Shishupala. Some supported Bhishma. The room became dangerous with competing voices. Krishna himself sat still through all of it. He had a particular ability to remain completely calm when the people around him were losing their composure. He knew something that Shishupala did not, that he had made a promise long ago to Shishupala's mother, who was his own aunt, that he would forgive her son 100 transgressions before acting against him. He had been counting. When Shishupala's insults crossed 100, Krishna stood up. He summoned the Sudarshana discus. The spinning wheel of divine energy flew from his hand and took Shishupala's head from his shoulders in a single clean motion. A pillar of light rose from Shishupala's body and merged with Krishna, as if the king's soul had returned to the source it had always come from. The assembly fell completely silent. The sacrifice was considered complete. The Rajasuya of Yudhishthira was done. Duryodhana stayed on in Indraprastha after the Rajasuya to look around the palace Maya had built. He walked through its rooms and corridors slowly, taking in every detail. He saw the treasures that had arrived as tribute during the Digvijaya. He saw the quality of the guests who had come, the number of kings who had acknowledged his cousins. He saw the assembly hall itself with all its strange and perfect beauty. Then it happened. He was walking through a section of the hall where Maya had created the illusion of a crystal floor over open space. The floor looked exactly like solid ground, but the area he was heading toward was actually a pool of water covered with lotus flowers. He walked forward confidently and stepped into the pool. He went in up to his thighs, soaking his fine clothing, and looked up to find servants and bystanders trying to hide their smiles. He pulled himself out, deeply embarrassed, and kept walking. Then at another point he stopped before what looked like a pool of water and paused, lifting his robes carefully before stepping in. The floor was dry crystal. There was no water. He stepped down gingerly onto completely solid ground and realized his error. More people saw this one. He walked faster. A few moments later he came to a door that was not a door but a wall made of crystal so clear that it looked like open air. He walked straight into it and hit his head. He stood there for a moment with his hand pressed to his face while the room pretended not to notice. At some point during all of this, Draupadi saw him and laughed. The sound of her laughter was not vicious. It was the natural laughter of someone watching a series of mishaps in a beautiful and confusing space. But Duryodhana heard it as something else. He heard the laughter of a woman who had once been stripped in an open court and survived that humiliation too, who now lived in a palace that made his own look modest, who was married to 5 men, who had just become rulers of the world, who was laughing at him. He walked out of Indraprastha without speaking to anyone. He climbed into his chariot and rode back to Hastinapura. The entire journey he barely said a word. By the time he arrived, he had made up his mind. He was going to destroy the Pandavas. He was going to take everything they had. He was going to find the right weapon for it, and the weapon he reached for was not a sword. Duryodhana went to his uncle Shakuni. Shakuni was the brother of Gandhari and had lived in Hastinapura for years as a member of the family. He was intelligent in a way that was almost impossible to trust. He saw the world as a series of moves and counter-moves, like a player who never stops calculating. He was also genuinely devoted to Duryodhana in his own way and genuinely happy to help him destroy people. Duryodhana told him everything: the palace, the wealth, the humiliation of the hall, the laughter of Draupadi. He said he could not eat. He could not sleep. The image of Indraprastha sitting there gleaming on the other side of the kingdom was an insult that existed in his eyes every time he closed them. Shakuni listened and then smiled. He said he had been thinking about this problem for some time, and he had a solution. He said it would be almost impossible to defeat the Pandavas in battle. Arjuna was the greatest archer alive. Bhima was the strongest man alive. They had Krishna as an ally. A military campaign would fail. But there was something else. He said, Yudhishthira loves dice. He plays with passion and without skill. He cannot refuse a challenge once it is made, because a warrior who refuses an invitation to a game of dice violates his own code of honor. And I, Shakuni told Duryodhana quietly, have never lost a game of dice in my life. They went together to Dhritarashtra. Duryodhana made the case: invite the Pandavas for a friendly game. Let Shakuni play on behalf of the Kaurava side. Dhritarashtra listened, and his heart was uncomfortable. Vidura, his wisest brother, was also there. Vidura said plainly that this was a terrible idea and would lead to disaster. Dhritarashtra wavered. He loved his son. He was blind in both his eyes and in his heart where Duryodhana was concerned. He agreed. The invitation was sent. Yudhishthira arrived at Hastinapura with his brothers and Draupadi. The new assembly hall had been specially built for this event, large and beautiful and full of important men: Bhishma, Drona, Karna, Vidura, Dhritarashtra, and all the Kaurava brothers. They sat in rows on either side. Yudhishthira knew something was wrong with this gathering. He felt it the moment he walked in. But he had no honorable way to leave. The invitation had been accepted. The game had to be played. Duryodhana announced that Shakuni would play on his behalf. Yudhishthira agreed. The dice were thrown. Shakuni picked them up, rolled them, and called his numbers with an ease that was deeply unsettling to watch. He never seemed to think. He always won. Yudhishthira staked gold. He lost. He staked more gold. He lost again. He staked horses. He staked elephants. He staked chariots and the treasury of Indraprastha. Each time the dice came up against him. Around the assembly, men watched with different expressions. Some were uneasy but said nothing. Vidura stood up and spoke loudly. He said this was wrong. He said Shakuni was using loaded dice. He said the game should stop. Dhritarashtra told him to be quiet. Yudhishthira kept playing. He could not stop. Every loss made him feel that the next throw would turn things around. Every throw was against him. He staked his kingdom. He lost it. He staked his 4 brothers one by one. He lost each of them. He staked himself. He lost. Then someone said, "There is one more stake you have not played." Yudhishthira looked up. They meant Draupadi, his wife, the queen who had been born from fire. Yudhishthira staked her. Shakuni threw the dice. He won. Draupadi was declared a slave of the Kauravas. The room went very quiet and then very loud all at once. Duryodhana's brother Dushasana was sent to bring Draupadi to the assembly. She was in her chambers, resting. Dushasana went in and told her she was now a slave of the Kauravas and must come with him. She refused. He grabbed her by the hair and dragged her into the open assembly hall. She was in the middle of her monthly cycle and not properly dressed. She stumbled into the hall with her hair loose and her clothes disheveled, pulled forward by the force of Dushasana's grip. Draupadi did not scream or weep. She looked around the hall at the men sitting in it and she asked a question. She asked it clearly and she asked it more than once. She said, "Was Yudhishthira already a slave to himself when he staked me? Because if he had already lost himself at that point, he had no right to stake anything else, including his wife. She was not his property to lose. Once he had become someone else's property himself." The question was a good one. It was a genuine legal and philosophical question that had no easy answer. Bhishma said the matter was beyond his understanding and refused to give a clear ruling. Drona was silent. Karna said something cruel. He said a wife follows her husband's fate and she should stop asking questions. Vidura tried to speak but was silenced. The Kaurava brothers shouted and made noise to prevent any real discussion from happening. Duryodhana bared his thigh and looked at Draupadi, inviting her to sit on it. This was the worst possible insult a man could offer a woman in that culture. Bhima's hands gripped the arms of his seat so hard the wood cracked. He swore an oath in that moment that he would one day break Duryodhana's thigh. Arjuna's face was white. The younger brothers were shaking. But they had all been staked and lost. They were slaves. They could not act. Then Dushasana began to pull at Draupadi's clothing. He was trying to disrobe her in the open hall, in front of every king and elder. Draupadi called out to Krishna. She had let go of her sari with both hands and raised them to the sky. As Dushasana pulled, the cloth kept coming and would not end. It piled up around him in yards and yards of fabric and he could not find the edge of it. He eventually stopped, exhausted, sitting in a heap of cloth that had come from somewhere that seemed to have no bottom. Draupadi stood draped and covered. Something divine had intervened where no human in the room was willing to. From somewhere outside the hall came sounds that made the hairs stand up on the necks of everyone present. Jackals howled, donkeys brayed, birds screamed. Bad omens arriving in a city in daylight were understood to mean that destruction was close. Dhritarashtra finally stirred in his seat. He had been sitting through all of this without stopping any of it. The sounds outside shook him. His advisor Vidura spoke to him again, quietly and firmly. Dhritarashtra called Draupadi to him. Dhritarashtra asked Draupadi to choose a boon. She was careful. She asked for Yudhishthira to be freed from slavery. Dhritarashtra granted it. He asked her to choose a second boon. She asked for her other 4 husbands to be freed and to have their weapons returned to them. He granted that too. He offered her a third boon. She declined it. She said a warrior's wife asks for no more than 2 boons. She said her husbands were now free. And with their weapons back they could earn everything else themselves. Dhritarashtra went further. He said the game was over. He returned their kingdom. He told them they could go back to Indraprastha and rule as before. He said he had been wrong to let the game proceed. Yudhishthira accepted quietly and the Pandavas prepared to leave. But Duryodhana would not let it rest. He went to his father and made a scene. He said if the Pandavas left with their kingdom and their weapons, they would spend the next months preparing for war and would come back to destroy the Kauravas. He argued and pressed until Dhritarashtra agreed to one more game. Duryodhana said the terms were simple. Whoever lost would go into forest exile for 12 years and then 1 year in disguise, living among ordinary people, unseen and unknown. If they were recognized during the 13th year, the exile would begin again from the start. Yudhishthira came back into the hall. He sat down again. He played again. He lost again. Shakuni's dice fell as they always fell when he was behind them. The Pandavas lost for the last time. They went home to Indraprastha, gathered what they needed, said their farewells, and walked out of their city and into 13 years of living without it. The Sabha Parva is one of the most painful books in the whole epic, and it is painful not because of violence but because of silence. In the great assembly hall, while Draupadi was being dragged in by her hair, while Dushasana was pulling at her clothing, while she was asking a question that deserved an answer, the most important men in that room said nothing. Bhishma said nothing useful. Drona said nothing. Dhritarashtra sat and listened. These were not cowards in any ordinary sense. Bhishma had taken down warriors of divine power. Drona had taught archery to men who would one day reshape the world. But in that moment they stayed in their seats and allowed something terrible to happen in their presence. The Sabha Parva asks us to sit with the discomfort of that silence. It does not explain it away. It does not tell us that these men had no choice. It simply shows us what they did and what they did not do. Dhritarashtra's blindness in this book is not just the blindness of his eyes. It is the blindness of a father who wants his son to be happy more than he wants the world to be right. That kind of blindness has no cure. Duryodhana's jealousy is also presented without being simplified. He is not jealous of small things. He is jealous of the whole sweep of the Pandavas' lives, their survival, their city, their allies, their queen, their righteousness, the way everything seems to confirm that they are meant to be great. He cannot compete with that on its own terms. He cannot build a better palace or run a better kingdom or be a better man. So he reaches for the one weapon that does not require any of those things. He finds a cheat and invites a fool and watches the whole edifice come apart in one afternoon. He wins and he ruins himself in the same moment, though he does not know that yet. Yudhishthira's gambling is also not a simple weakness. The text shows it as something closer to a compulsion, a place where his judgment simply stops working. He is the most righteous man in the epic in almost every other area of his life. Here he cannot stop. He knows something is wrong. He keeps playing. He loses things that were never his to stake, his brothers, his wife, other living people. The Sabha Parva puts this in front of us and asks us to understand that good people can do deeply harmful things when a particular kind of blindness takes hold of them too. Without the Sabha Parva there is no great war. The war does not come from the house of lack or the forest exile or even from the question of who should sit on the Kuru throne. It comes from a single afternoon in a hall with crystal floors, where a man with loaded dice took everything, where an unanswered question still hangs in the air after thousands of years, and where the men who should have spoken chose not to. The Sabha Parva ends with the Pandavas walking out of Hastinapura into their exile. They are not broken. They are furious. Bhima is carrying an oath about Duryodhana's thigh and Dushasana's blood. Arjuna is carrying something cold and settled in his chest that will take the shape of arrows later. Draupadi has loosened her hair and sworn not to bind it until she can wash it in Dushasana's blood. These are not the promises of people who have given up. These are the promises of people who are counting the days. The Pandavas step outside the city, and the Namisha forest is still there in the background, still listening. Sauti is still speaking. Shaunaka and the sages are still gathered around the fire. They all know what is coming. The Sabha Parva has set the terms of the war, and the terms are personal in a way that no political dispute could ever be. This is no longer about territory or inheritance. It is about a woman dragged by her hair, an unanswered question, and 12 years of waiting that will produce something the world has never seen before and will never see again. This essay is part of the Deep Thoughts series on Mahabharata, exploring the Mahabharata's most difficult moral questions, its characters, their choices, and what those choices mean for us today. Read the full essay and discover more at https://mahabharata.at.